The bomb didn't explode in a courtroom, it detonated in silence behind oak doors, stamped in legal ink, and whispered through palace corridors before the world even realized what had happened. Meghan Markle reportedly subpoenaed, and Prince Harry privately claiming that meetings involving Prince Andrew may have shaped the very custody terms now tearing their world apart. On the morning of February 17, 2026, Prince William stood before cameras at Buckingham Palace, flanked by Princess Anne and the Duchess of Edinburgh, and delivered 7 words that froze Britain mid-breath: "It is final." That was the official ending. But endings are rarely where the real story begins, because what followed behind those sealed pages, inside that 94-page agreement signed 2 days earlier, was not closure. It was ignition. And according to insiders now whispering through legal back channels in California and London alike, the custody framework that stripped decision-making power from Harry did not form in isolation. It formed in shadow. It formed while private consultations were allegedly unfolding that Harry now claims he did not fully understand at the time. The subpoena, reportedly issued quietly through California Superior Court under a sealed procedural request, was not theatrical. No flashing lights, no public announcement, just paperwork, cold, strategic, surgical. Its focus? Communications, timelines, advisory involvement, and most explosively, the alleged advisory contacts connected to Prince Andrew during the period when Clause 7, that infamous narrative control clause, was first being activated as leverage during custody negotiations. The timing is what has everyone uneasy, because while the palace was finalizing emergency guardianship protocols and invoking ancient custodial statutes, Harry was allegedly uncovering fragments of something else entirely. That discussions he believed were strategic branding talks may have bled into the custody framework itself. Clause 7 was already radioactive. Drafted in 2018, buried in prenuptial fine print, it granted Meghan sweeping intellectual property control over Harry's likeness, voice, unpublished materials, and narrative derivatives. For years, it operated invisibly. But when the February 15 settlement forced its partial exposure, Harry reportedly began tracing its ripple effects. Every interview, every Netflix special, every podcast, every carefully framed public narrative. And now, according to sources close to the California filing, Harry claims that advisory conversations linked to Andrew's circle may have influenced how that clause was positioned during custody structuring, not directly on paper, but in tone, in strategy, in negotiation psychology. Prince Andrew, long isolated from former royal duties and desperate to recalibrate his public position, had allegedly maintained discreet contact channels with figures orbiting the Sussex media machine. The palace has not confirmed this, but Harry's petition reportedly references external advisory influence inconsistent with the best interests of minor children. That language alone is nuclear in family court, because custody cases hinge on one question: what protects the children? And if Harry now believes that custody leverage may have been shaped by strategic positioning rather than child-first consideration, that is not a marital dispute. That is structural warfare. Inside Windsor, the reaction was said to be glacial. Princess Anne, already the architect of the Marl withdrawal file and the one who activated the custodial breach assessment, reportedly received notification of the subpoena before it reached public awareness. Those who understand Anne understand what silence means in her presence: stillness, calculation, containment. Because while Harry may be questioning advisory influence, the Crown stance remains ironclad. The February 15th settlement is final. Custodial authority has been transferred. Guardianship protocols enacted. Appendix 4 invoked. And yet, subpoenas create paper trails. Paper trails create discovery. Discovery creates exposure. Meghan's team, according to legal observers in Santa Barbara, has not publicly acknowledged the subpoena. That silence is strategic. A subpoena does not equal guilt. It does not even equal accusation. It equals inquiry. But inquiry alone shifts the atmosphere. Because if communications logs, advisory memos, or indirect strategic consultations surface that show discussions about how custody optics could be shaped through narrative control clauses, the optics shift overnight. Not legally, perhaps, but reputationally. And reputation is oxygen in a world built on public positioning. What makes this development combustible is not simply Andrew's name surfacing again. It is timing. Andrew has already faced reputational collapse, his former royal presence reduced, institutional ties severed, and now his alleged advisory proximity, even informal, being pulled into a custody narrative involving children. The palace firewall that historians say held in February may now be facing microscopic scrutiny from the outside, because while the settlement sealed custodial authority, it did not seal questions. Harry, reportedly described by one insider as measured but resolute, is said to believe he was shielded from the full scope of advisory influences during the height of negotiations. Whether that belief stems from documentation or suspicion remains unclear, but suspicion alone, once formalized in court language, becomes part of record, and record becomes history. Meanwhile, public reaction is fractured. Some see a father seeking clarity after realizing the machinery around him was more complex than he grasped. Others see escalation, reopening wounds that the February announcement was meant to cauterize. Social media, predictably, has turned speculative. Hashtags questioning advisory ethics trend alongside ones defending strategic autonomy. The monarchy remains publicly still. William has not commented further since the February 17th statement. Catherine's quiet appearances continue, deliberate and composed. The institution projects stability, but subpoenas pierce stability with procedure. And here is the question hanging over all of it. If meetings happened, even informal, even strategic, that blended narrative leverage with custody timing, does that change the moral frame of what unfolded? The court will determine legal weight, but morality is tried in public consciousness. Harry's alleged claim that Andrew-linked advisory influence shaped custody discussions is not yet proven. It is not adjudicated. It is not even fully confirmed beyond sealed references, but its existence as a claim reopens everything the palace worked to finalize. Because once you suggest that custody was influenced by strategic positioning rather than solely child welfare calculus, you shift the center of gravity. And gravity, once shifted, pulls everything with it. Brand, legacy, loyalty, trust. Meghan stands at the center of that vortex now, reportedly subpoenaed, reportedly compelled to clarify communications and advisory timelines. Whether this is a legal tremor or the first crack in something larger depends entirely on what discovery reveals. For now, the world watches a second act forming behind closed doors, quieter than February's declaration, but potentially more destabilizing. But the Crown may have said it is final, but courts operate on a different vocabulary. And in that vocabulary, questions do not disappear, they deepen. The subpoena may have been quiet, but the aftershocks were anything but, because once court machinery starts turning, it does not care about fairy tales, titles, or carefully curated images. It cares about timestamps, correspondence logs, advisory notes, and who said what to whom when custody. Frameworks were being shaped, and this is where the narrative becomes dangerously layered, because while the palace declared the settlement final on February 17th, Harry's alleged private claims suggest that the emotional and strategic groundwork for that finality may have been influenced long before the public ever saw 7 sealed words. Inside California legal circles, whispers describe the filing as narrow but sharp, not a sprawling accusation, not a reckless public assault, a targeted request seeking clarity on communications tied to the period when custody terms were hardening and Clause 7's reach was being evaluated against the backdrop of emergency guardianship actions in the UK. And if that sounds technical, it is. Because this isn't about dramatic confrontations in hallways. It is about how narrative control intersects with parental authority. Harry reportedly believes that the intellectual property leverage embedded in Clause 7 did not simply sit in the background as a branding tool. He now suspects it influenced negotiating posture when custodial discussions intensified. If true, that would mean the very clause that gave Meghan control over his voice may have indirectly shaped how custody leverage was perceived. And then there is Andrew, always in the background, rarely in the spotlight anymore, yet impossible to fully erase from royal gravity. The allegation is not that Andrew dictated custody terms, it is more subtle, more unsettling, that individuals within his orbit may have offered strategic insight about palace legal vulnerabilities at a moment when Meghan's team was navigating both narrative positioning and custodial tension. Andrew, already sidelined from formal royal engagement, had little institutional power left, but institutional memory that he still possessed, knowledge of how the crown reacts, how it negotiates, how it closes ranks. And if that knowledge was shared, even casually, even hypothetically, it becomes combustible once children are involved. Harry's reported emotional state during this unfolding is described as restrained but internally fractured. The man who allegedly muttered, "If this spares them, I'll vanish myself," when signing away primary custodial decision-making authority, is not the same man now asking whether external advisory voices influenced the very framework he agreed to. Something shifted. Either information surfaced, or clarity arrived too late. Either way, a father now appears to be re-examining the architecture of a settlement that cost him more than reputation. It cost him proximity to daily decisions about his children. Meanwhile, Meghan's camp is said to be calculating carefully. A subpoena demands response, but response can be strategic. Documentation can contextualize. Communications can be reframed. Advisory interactions can be characterized as unrelated to custody, and that is the tightrope now being walked. Because even if meetings or communications occurred, the question is not whether people talk, it is whether those conversations influence custodial positioning in a way that prioritizes strategy over stability. In family court language, that distinction is everything. Back in Windsor, the atmosphere is reportedly disciplined. No public retaliation. No statements escalating the situation. The monarchy learned long ago that endurance outlasts outrage. Princess Anne, architect of the emergency guardianship escalation, is said to be monitoring developments with cold precision. William's silence continues. Catherine's composed public appearances project continuity. The Crown does not chase subpoenas across oceans. It waits, it records, it adapts. Public opinion, however, is less restrained. Some see Harry's move as courageous, a father unwilling to ignore even the possibility that advisory politics seeped into custody calculus. Others see it as destabilizing, reopening fragile wounds and potentially dragging Andrew's already damaged name back into proximity with children in custody headlines. Social feeds fracture into camps. Analysts dissect wording. Legal commentators debate whether the subpoena signals strength or desperation. Because subpoenas can mean confidence, you believe documentation supports you. Or they can mean suspicion, you are searching for what you fear might exist. And then there is the larger shadow hovering over everything: reputation. Meghan built a brand on autonomy, narrative ownership, strategic media mastery. Clause 7 symbolized that mastery: control over story, image, derivative legacy. But if the court conversation now circles around whether narrative leverage intersected with custody dynamics, that brand recalculates overnight, because narrative control is admired in entertainment. In custody battles, it is scrutinized. Andrew's alleged advisory proximity complicates matters further. Already diminished, already isolated, he now becomes a name whispered in filings tied to children. Whether his involvement was peripheral or non-existent beyond rumor, the mere suggestion reactivates every controversy associated with him. And in reputational ecosystems, proximity is often as powerful as proof. What happens next depends entirely on discovery. If documentation reveals nothing tying advisory discussions to custody structuring, the storm may dissipate into legal footnotes. If fragments suggest influence, even indirect, the narrative reopens globally. The February 17th Declaration of Finality would not be undone legally, but it would be re-examined morally. Harry stands in an uncomfortable position, not fully outside the institution, not fully within it, a father questioning architecture he once trusted. Meghan stands at the center of scrutiny she did not publicly invite, but now must navigate with precision. Andrew remains silent, his name hovering like smoke no one wants to claim. And the children, the quiet center of this storm, remain shielded by legal text, biometric vault clauses, narrative freeze provisions, and the cold language of institutional protection. The monarchy insists the firewall held. Harry appears to be asking whether smoke slipped through before the wall was sealed. The story is no longer about a marriage. It is about influence, about who shaped the shape of things, about whether strategy crept into spaces reserved for stability. And until the court clarifies what communications reveal, if anything at all, the question lingers in every corridor, every filing, every whispered briefing: did advisory politics touch custody talks? Or is this simply the final tremor of a relationship that collapsed under its own weight? One thing is certain: finality declared on camera does not always mean finality in discovery. And once paperwork begins asking questions, silence becomes its own kind of answer.